everyone, this is Brandi Propes and
Jackie Wilson.
And today we are doing our presentation on the vision of William Penn. We are doing this virtually because we couldn't be at class today because we have another educational opportunity that we were going to. So we are going to be voice recording over what we did and showing you kind of the run through of our presentation from virtual aspects. So we're excited to share with you and kind of go over what the vision of William Penn was and the legacy that he provided for Pennsylvania and the state that we obviously are now in and get to live in. So who actually is this man, William Penn? As you can guess, based off of his name and some history that you may have already known about William Penn, he is the one who is given credit for founding the province of Pennsylvania, the British North American colony that became the U.S. state of Pennsylvania later on. He was a Quaker from England who wanted people to be able to freely practice their religions. And because of his gaining of land, he was able to do so and give people a new opportunity that they weren't previously granted when they lived in England. He oversaw the founding of the American Commonwealth of Pennsylvania as a refugee for Quakers and other religious minorities of Europe, which we will dive into deeper in the following slides. As I mentioned before, William Penn was given the land, but how exactly did he get his hand on this much land? It was on March 4th, 1681, that King Charles II of England granted William Penn a New World colony as a payment for a debt of 16,000 pounds that the king owed to Penn's late father, a deceased admiral in the British Navy. Not only was he paying off the debt, but at the same time, he was ridding his country of Quakers, a religious sect that constantly challenged English laws and the legitimacy of Anglican Church, the nation's established church. To him, this was a good thing that they would be gone, and it was also a good thing for them that they would be able to create their new land. So there went the voyagers, beginning on their journey from England to the New World, to the unestablished colony to begin their new lives. They named the colony Penn's Woods in honor of Penn's father, the fallen admiral. This was Penn's chance to start new and use the colony as experiments for running the new land and creating his own rules for government and life. Some of these new ideas that Penn had in mind for his new land were a sense of brotherly love, religious tolerance, and participatory government, which we will dive deeper into in the following slides. So what exactly did it mean that Penn wanted to create a feeling of brotherly love? Well, for starters, he called the capital city Philadelphia, meaning the city of brotherly love, to reflect his desire that his colony would serve as a haven for Quakers and other oppressed Christians seeking religious freedom. He did this in order to extend the love to anyone who was wanting this religious freedom so that they may all feel comfortable occupying the land. He also made a momentous effort to reach out to the Indian tribes that were previously occupying the land. Rather than simply occupying the land without consent of the Lenape, Penn wrote letters to the Lenape chiefs asking for permission to share the land. According to legend, Penn and the Lenape chiefs signed a treaty under a large elm tree that the French philosopher Voltaire called the only treaty between the Indian nations and the Christians that was not ratified by oath and was never broken. That is something very impressive and took great initiative on Penn to do so and make great strides to bring peace to the land. He also established a Friends public school in 1689. He did this in order to preserve the vision of his holy experiment for future generations and to provide literacy and morality for all of Philadelphia's children. We will go into this more into a later slide, But this is something that he chose to do that created a sense of love to all and would travel on for generations in the future to come. A quote featured from Penn's treaty to the Lenape was, "Enjoy the land with your love and consent so that we may always live together as neighbors and friends." This was just another example of how he extended his brotherly love to all that were inhabiting his land. Penn also had a vision of religious tolerance in his new land. He guaranteed the settlers of his new land freedom of religious worship. This is something very attractive to newcomers of the land because this is something that they didn't previously have in England. This was all part of his holy experiment, which was allowing people to freely practice their religion. This is something that was not done before, and so he was testing out the waters in his whole new world. Members of many religious sects were enticed by this and all headed to Penn's refugee. This rare offer attracted not only Quakers who had been persecuted in England, but also other Europeans who had suffered because of their religious beliefs. Quakers from the British Isles and Germany, French Huguenots, English and Irish Catholics, Lutherans from Catholic German states, Swiss Amish, German Mennonites, and members of many other religious sects all headed to Penn's refugee. Settlers of many faiths worshipped in private homes and storehouses and barns until they could erect their own houses of worship. This is why there are many diverse churches and places of worship all throughout Pennsylvania today. For Penn, Indians and European settlers also working together, regardless of their faith, would glorify the Almighty. This was part of his giant vision of ultimately creating an area where everyone could glorify God in his eyes, and hopefully for him, this would work out in his benefit. More about Penn's holy experiment was that this was Penn's term for the ideal government, was that people could freely practice their religions, but this would only be successful if the colony was settled with people of virtue whose spirituality would shape Pennsylvania's society, law, and politics. This would essentially require a lot of upstanding citizens that all had a similar vision in mind. This is where things for Penn could start getting a little sticky in his overall idea of what Pennsylvania was supposed to be. So Pennsylvania was a place where you were guaranteed religious freedom, but restrictions were put on that religious freedom very soon. Pennsylvania's charter restricted the right to vote and to hold any political office to only Protestants. Pennsylvania denied those rights to Jews and Muslims who did not believe in Christ as Savior, and to Catholics who were subservient to the Pope. For these groups, like other non-Protestant in the colony, religious toleration meant that they were free to worship and practice their faith in Pennsylvania, but not hold the positions and vote in Pennsylvania. Also, Penn did not extend the protections of his charter to enslaved Africans and or African Americans either. Indeed, the proprietor kept at least 3 slaves at Pennsbury, his country estate above Philadelphia. The presence of race slavery in Penn's holy experiment would be a source of growing tension among the Quakers and other Pennsylvania colonists for the next 100 years.
So, as Brandi mentioned in an earlier slide, we're diving deeper into the school system that Penn had put in place. So, the school was called the Friends Public School, and it was founded in 1689 to provide the fundamentals of literacy and morality to all of Philadelphia's children. That meant that Quaker, non-Quaker, rich, poor, male, and female children could all attend this school. The idea behind it was to preserve the vision of Penn's holy experiment for the future generations. The Friends Public School later evolved into what is now Philadelphia's public school system, and it was also the first institution in America to emphasize training in both education and vocational learning. You can see on a picture in the right, I have a little picture of what is still there from the first Friends Public School in Philadelphia. So now we're going to talk about how Penn's colony was actually an experiment with democracy. So the first constitution set in place was entitled The Frame of Government. And you can see that on the right side of the slide. I have a little picture there to see. And this promised settlers the enjoyment of liberties such as a voice in the government and the right of trial by jury, which we still see in our government today. To prevent corruption in the government, Penn organized it into 3 different parts. This consisted of a governor, a provincial council, and bicameral legislature, which was elected by the people, and this was when the upper house drafted legislation and the lower house voted to approve or reject it. However, heated disagreements ended up breaking out between the Quakers who administered the government and non-Quaker settlers over disagreements about land distribution, rental fees, political patronage, the Quaker monopoly of commerce, and Penn's inability to govern effectively. So, on October 28, 1701, Penn ended up issuing a new constitution, which you can see on the right side of the slide again, which was new and improved, and it was called the Charter of Privileges. Now, this new constitution was pretty much set in place to please the fighting settlers, and it reaffirmed the Assembly's right to draft legislation, choose its speaker and other officers, and exercise all other powers and privileges of an assembly according to the freedom subjects of England. It also reduced the council's role to an advisory capacity and eliminated the governor's power to suspend or dissolve the assembly, although the governor could continue to veto legislation. So although the Charter of Privileges proved to be almost exactly the opposite of what Penn had wanted when he established Pennsylvania almost 2 decades earlier, the new Constitution did enhance the principle of self-government and preserved, on paper, if not always in practice, Penn's unconditional commitment to religious toleration. The Charter of Privileges served as Pennsylvania's Constitution until overturned by the American Revolution almost 75 years later. But Penn's legacy of toleration can still be seen in the First Amendment, which is the protection of religious liberty, as well as in many reform organizations that still exist today. So William Penn still has a very large legacy left on Pennsylvania, as we can see today. So for our student lesson, we based it off of a 4th grade level. Our rationale for teaching it would be that it's important for the students to understand how Pennsylvania was founded and the different principles that it was founded upon. For our set for a lesson, we would have the students all come to a section in the room where there's a carpet or something on the ground that we can all come together. And we would start off by talking about what it means to come to a new land. We would ask the students to share out and have a conversation about different facts and history that they already know about people coming to new lands and what that means. This would just get them ready to start talking about William Penn and Pennsylvania. Our objective, we decided, would be the students will be able to create their own newly given land from the king. As for materials we would need for this lesson, we would obviously need a PowerPoint to teach the content, or a book that we would read from, whether that be our history book or a handout of some sort to teach the content to the students. We would also need technology to have the students research, as well as different tools for them to present their projects at the end. For the procedure or sequence of instruction, so we would start off with our set, obviously, and just start building context for the students. Then we would have them go back to their seats and we would go through all of the content we wanted to teach for the lesson about William Penn. Then we would break the students off into groups, and we would explain that we want them to now create their own newly given land from a king. So here we could have a lot of fun with it. It's really just allowing the students to apply the information they learned from Penn and what worked for him, what didn't work for him, and to really come up with their own ideas. So they would work in groups to come up with all these different ideas. They could research different things. And then after they compile all this information, we want them to create some sort of presentation to share with the class. So whether this be a Google Doc for literacy learners or a skit for our musical learners, whatever it is, we want the students to choose and get creative. For our closure, we would have the students present for their assessment and closure. Some essential learning skills that would be touched in this lesson are definitely communication and collaboration, due to them working in groups and having to collaborate and communicate with one another. And lastly, for the principles of excellent social studies instruction, this lesson's meaningful to the students because it's about Pennsylvania and how Pennsylvania was founded. And that's where they're living, so it's meaningful to their lives. It is challenging because the content itself is pretty challenging to understand, just due to all the different dates and the fact that it's kind of abstract for elementary students. Lastly, the lesson is active because we have the students moving around the classroom, meeting together as for the set and having a discussion, and then the instruction on the lesson, and then getting into groups, moving around the classroom, coming up with their presentations, researching. So it's a very active lesson that the students will be able to not just be sitting in their seats the whole time, but moving around and collaborating with their fellow classmates. Okay, so with all of that being said, this is the end of our presentation on William Penn and what we would do for a lesson. We hope you take away something from this presentation, and we hope you enjoyed.